Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining the IS Reading Summit and this important discussion of how to better support struggling readers. My name is Bitnara Jasmine Park, and I am a senior researcher at American Institute for Research. During the past 8 years, I've been with AIR. I have worked with various NAEP-related projects, including conducting research studies using the NAEP data to answer important policy-relevant questions, such as how we can better support young readers with the reading difficulties. In particular, English learners are my passion, being one myself, and also raising two children in a bilingual environment. As many of you know, the percentage of students identified as English learners has continued to increase. And according to the 2019 NAEP data, they make up about 12% of fourth graders in US schools, and many of them are US born. Additionally, the English learner population has become more diverse, not only in terms of their linguistic and cultural backgrounds, but also in terms of regions where we see increase in this population. In the past, we tend to assume that this was just an issue for large coastal states like California, Florida, and Texas. But now we see a steep increase in the population in other states, such as Delaware and North Carolina, which makes the policy and practice discussion of improving support for English learners relevant to all states and jurisdictions in the US. So, where do we begin? I believe today's presentation, Developing Oral Language and Literacy for Young Emergent Bilinguals, really shows the importance of starting this work early, beginning with early childhood, supporting the development of an oral language to build a strong foundation for English learners as they develop literacy and reading skills. I am delighted to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Lauren Artzi and Dr. Rebecca Bergey, who are my colleagues at American Institute for Research. Dr. Artzi is a senior researcher at AIR. She has over 15 years of experience in education, working as an ESL teacher, as well as a school-based instructional mentor, and conducting education research and providing technical assistance, focusing on the areas of second language education, literacy instruction for English learners and students with disabilities, and multi-tier systems of support. She leads several studies funded by IES and Office of Special Education Programs, and she actively disseminates her work in various journals, including Reading Research Quarterly, elementary school journals, and others. Dr. Bergey is a senior researcher in the Center for English Learners at AIR. She has over a decade of experience working with multilingual students as a secondary ESL teacher and as a trainer of pre-service and service teachers prior to her research career. At AIR, she primarily works on research studies that support the education of English learners and dual language learners, as well as analyzing educational policy with the lenses for these students. She also provides technical assistance to schools and districts with the multilingual student populations. She currently serves as a deputy project director on the first 5 California dual language pilot evaluation, which focuses on understanding language and literacy practices in multilingual early care settings. Before I welcome our presenters, I'd like to remind you a couple of housekeeping items. I'll be moderating a Q&A session after the presentation, so please enter any questions or comments you have for the presenters in the chat box. Also, the resources that our presenters want to share are available at the bottom of the screen. Now, please join me welcoming Dr. Artzi and Bergey.
Welcome to today's session on developing oral language and literacy for young emergent bilinguals. Today we'll be focusing specifically on shared book reading. And for today's session, we will be looking at an introduction to the research background related to shared reading. We'll talk about ways within the context of shared interactive reading to support children's vocabulary practices, their oral language development, as well as writing connected to the text. I'm joined today by my colleague, Rebecca Bergey, and I'm Lauren Artzi. We are both senior researchers at the American Institutes for Research, and we work in research and technical assistance projects related to language acquisition, English language learning, and multi-tiered systems of support. For today's session, we'll have a resource list that accompanies the session and with some resources that are open access and available to anyone. We seek to disseminate the resources that are available, though we do not necessarily endorse any specific resource. But we wanted to highlight, when talking about practices and practices within shared reading and ways to promote students' literacy skills and their language proficiency, this is a resource that came out a couple of years ago. It is a National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine report, and it has a lot of different chapters. The chapters that focus on practice is chapter 7 and 8. You can see that chapter 10 is related to dual language learners and English learners with disabilities. And then promising and effective practices and assessment is highlighted in chapter 10. We'll be referring to students who are dual language learners and English learners in this session as emergent bilinguals, as children are developing their bilingualism across both languages. We know that a strong home language affords children developmental advantages for learning a second language, and the development of oral language can support early literacy. 97% of students out of 4.8 million students in U.S. schools that are English learners as of 2014, 2015, 97% participated in a language instruction program. And Spanish is the most commonly spoken home language, but there's a wide variety of languages spoken across the U.S. And so we'll talk broadly about effective practices. We did want to describe a little bit related to the concept of the early childhood education continuum. So this session focuses on considerations for younger learners in early elementary school and preschool contexts. And high quality early childhood experiences can lead to better prepared children for kindergarten. Learning opportunities in early childhood can increase language and literacy skills, so children are better prepared for kindergarten entry. And there's some work around, for instance, having professional learning communities that include vertical teaming can help support continuity across the early childhood education continuum. So this is really to think of a cohesive approach to early childhood education as well as early elementary. And we will be talking about effective practices and shared book reading that can be used across the continuum, the early childhood continuum. For literacy, we know that children must be proficient word decoders and have strong skills around word recognition, such as phonological awareness, decoding, phonics, and alphabetics. But their language comprehension skills are also really important. So including skills around vocabulary instruction, oral language proficiency, background knowledge, and understanding grammar and discourse structures. There's a couple of resources that will be on the resource list that talks about the early childhood continuum. Their sources are noted below, and they're also, you'll find them in the list as well. And then just briefly about some of the research background around practices to support emergent bilingual students who are dual language and English learners. Again, there's a couple of key resources we wanted to highlight. This is a manual called 10 Key Policies and Practices for Teaching English Learners. And in this guide, it's a guide that talks about, for instance, analyzing language demands of the lesson. Teachers can support students' learning by building background knowledge, incorporating explicit instruction, using home language support, providing opportunities around vocabulary instruction, peer engagement opportunities, using visual aids to scaffold instruction, and having assessment inform instruction. So this really dives deep into those areas. And again, you can find the link on your resources list. The next slide, which we'll focus on in the session, is a practice guide from What Works Clearinghouse. And there's some materials that accompany the practice guide. For instance, there's this RAL Southwest Professional Learning Community Guide that aligns with the practice guide, and it includes 23 videos that illustrate the recommendations. And on the next slide, there are 4 recommendations from this practice guide. We will be focused on kind of the first 3 recommendations around ways we can support vocabulary within shared reading and ways to provide structured opportunities around written language skills. The 4th recommendation pertains to considerations related to tiered instructional systems. We have a couple of resources in the resources list that can help support in that area, but we'll kind of focus this session on the language and vocabulary enhancements. So again, for today's session, we really wanted to kind of focus on shared book reading within kind of this early childhood continuum, and specifically ways that we can use shared reading to promote students' vocabulary, language, and writing skills. We know that storybook reading can provide rich language opportunities in the classroom, as found in the research, and it is something that can be used jointly in early childhood and early elementary school, and that supporting students' vocabulary knowledge is critical to their reading comprehension. So this includes, for instance, exposures to words in rich semantic context, explicit instruction, and building students' proficiency with becoming good independent word learners. And also, methods to develop dual language learners' language proficiency and literacy can build on effective practices, but we want to make sure to include specific effective practices that the research finds as important, such as language-based supports, previewing material, providing explicit instruction, providing model of a task. And as we're going to be talking through these practices, we'll be drawing on some examples from a specific program called COLTS, and I will turn it over to Rebecca to talk a little bit about that program.
Sure. So COLTS is a program that was developed to support early language and literacy by a team at AIR. And we actually conducted a small pilot study of the use of this program. And in this study, we found that children who participated in COLTS, they showed significantly larger gains in oral language proficiency. So some of the examples that we go through today will explain how we implemented these practices that Lauren just shared from the What Works Clearinghouse Guide into a specific program that we guided teachers through to support students' early language and literacy. So as we mentioned, we'll be focusing on the context of shared interactive reading. And so to begin with, let's talk about what is shared interactive reading and how does it take place. So interactive shared reading involves a teacher reading aloud to children while using questions and other strategies to model the reading, to engage children, and to support their comprehension. And research with both monolingual as well as dual language speakers consistently indicates that interactive shared reading has a positive impact on language outcomes. So we'll talk specifically about the types of pre-reading activities and discussion that can help emergent bilinguals for reading a new story, how to address and use open-ended questions and scaffolded responses during reading, and then as well as post-reading activities to guide the discussion and help summarize the story. So again, looking at this process, what happens during shared interactive reading, it takes place during pre, during, and post-reading activities. So in the pre-reading section, teachers are introducing the content, previewing the text, which can be done through a picture walk. They're making connections with children's lives and background knowledge. And then moving on to during reading. This is when teachers can model the reading strategies, use open-ended questions to engage children with the text. And then they can also use this time to highlight and build knowledge of new words within context of the story. And finally, during the post-reading time, this is when you continue to ask higher level questions. You can review vocabulary, have children summarize, and facilitate activities to reinforce the language. So these activities are taking place across the continuum of reading. And the important thing with interactive reading is that it's not just the teacher reading aloud or demonstrating the text, but it's finding ways to engage children and build their skills and interaction with the text as well. So let's take a look at an example of how this was used in the curriculum that we implemented. So in here, you can see a teacher guide and how a teacher used interactive reading to the children while using questions and other strategies in this example to support children's comprehension. So we see an example of these types of language routines that help children develop their language, foster the comprehension of the text, and develop conceptual knowledge. So for example, here we see examples of questions that ask the children to make inferences using the pictures, to comprehend the text narrative, and to also make predictions about events in the story. And this also, our teacher guide also included some anticipated responses. So thinking about what types of response you want to hope to engage with students. So when planning for shared interactive reading activities, this is something that you want to, some steps you want to take in advance. It's not just picking up the book and reading it, but it's thinking explicitly about the type of text that will, have engaged the children, but also provide high quality language experience for them. And then once you've selected the text, you want to go through and find what are areas that will be challenging for emergent bilinguals, what types of new vocabulary will be included, and how can you build in your supports and scaffolds all along the way. So thinking about the places and types of questions to ask, the vocabulary to target, and the types of supports to provide. And so we'll talk again about some of the ways that this can be done throughout the shared interactive reading activities.
As Rebecca was saying, there's many opportunities within shared interactive reading to really promote students' language skills, their vocabulary, and also provide opportunities to work on foundational literacy skills and writing. So we're going to focus in this section on vocabulary, which is a component of language, but we wanted to just describe a couple of key practices that the research finds effective for vocabulary instruction within shared reading. On the next slide, we see that recommendation 1 from the practice guide that I showed earlier from 2014 kind of talks about 4 different elements to consider with vocabulary instruction. Choosing text that includes academic vocabulary as a platform for more intensive instruction, choosing a small set of words for more in-depth instruction. Other words you can also target in the shared interactive reading through more embedded kind of parenthetical explanations for the word, and we'll show that example as well. You can also teach vocabulary through multiple language modalities such as reading and writing, and we'll show examples of that as well. And then 2, to help support students in becoming better independent word learners, there are some key word learning strategies that the research points to as well. So related to vocabulary instruction, you want to select words for more intensive, rich instruction that are high utility words for academic learning, so that are key to content area learning, that are frequent in academic texts, that provide a platform for rich instruction for the words. And then again, you can target other words through more embedded explanations, and then also teach relevant word learning strategies. For word selection, which it's always an important consideration. You want to choose words according to the recommendations in the practice guide that are central to understanding the text, frequently used in text, may appear across content areas, have multiple meanings, and have a lot of cross-language potential, and ways to support more robust academic conversations. There is a tool that is on your resources list. That's called the Word Analyzer tool, and it was developed at AIR. And what teachers and other educators can do is put text in to this tool. It is a free, you can sign up for it for free and put text into the tool, and then you'll get kind of an output related to the text that you put in of words that are shown as frequent in school text. So these are related to the 4,000 most frequent words from the My First 4,000 word list. And these words were also coded for attributes that may impact learning and acquisition, such as how imageable a word is. It also shows whether the word is a cognate with Spanish. So, whether there is the words sound similar, spelled similar, and mean similar things across the 2 languages. And all of this can help inform your word selection. Once you select the words, you want to use for high utility words this notion of rich vocabulary instruction. And this is just a routine that was utilized in COLTS that is also discussed in some of the research, where you can connect the word to a picture, call attention to the word if it's a cognate with other languages, You can also provide a child-friendly explanation of the word in English and other languages, talk about examples and non-examples with the word, provide peer-to-peer discussions with the word. So maybe you'll pose a prompt to students to then, turn and talk to each other about the word. So you want to provide opportunities for children to engage in different ways with the word. And to show you an example of what this looks like, for instance, this is the word unusual. And so you see the word in English as well as in Spanish, and some illustrations that show the word unusual. And then the backside of this would be kind of like the backside of a card or another kind of part in the PowerPoint that the teacher could talk through. And so this is related to one of the books in Colts, The Paper Crane. And this just shows the routine that the teacher used with the word unusual. So they first showed the picture, explained what the picture means. They provided a child-friendly meeting with the word unusual in English as well as Spanish. Then they had the students say the word a couple of times to get some of the oral expressive skills with the word. Then they posed a partner talk prompts. They said, eating ice cream for breakfast is unusual. Tell your partner about something you did that was unusual. So then now children were able to turn to each other. Perhaps they were on the rug and listening to the book, and the teacher kind of pre-taught this word. And so now students are turning to each other and discussing with each other, their answers to this prompt. They also, the teacher called attention to some of the sounds and the letters in the word. So they asked the students, for instance, what is the letter name? What sound does the letter U make? What starts the word? And then after reading, there was reinforcement with the word. So students kind of played a game where the teacher mentioned a couple of scenarios and the students had to give like a thumbs up or thumbs down if it illustrated the word. So for instance, one of them says, Anna takes a boat to school. Is that unusual? And the children would put their thumbs up because that is an unusual way to get to school. And so this is kind of one example of, how words can be explicitly instructed before a shared reading. Words can also be targeted through more embedded explanations within the text as well. So this, and also reinforced within the reading as well. So this shows, for instance, an example with the word manner. And manner was not necessarily focused on for intensive instruction, but it was still an important word for children to understand with the story. And so you can see that there's kind of an embedded explanation for the word manner, where the book said that the man had an unusual gentle manner, and the teacher explains that a manner is a way someone acts, so someone with a gentle manner acts in a nice, kind way. And then in addition to focusing on some high utility vocabulary words, in the early elementary years, teachers can also help support students in their independent word learning. And the research really talks about these 4 areas, such as the word reference skills, how to use glossaries, dictionaries, online word reference tools, how to look for words and clues to word meanings within the context, how to use, for instance, for morphology, prefix, suffixes, and roots to determine the meaning. And then cognate awareness is really important too for emergent bilinguals, because these are words that are shared across 2 languages. So different games and activities can be used to help students see when words are cognates, and calling attention to cognates when you see a cognate in a book or in the vocabulary that you're targeting can be really helpful for students as well.
Okay, so as you can see, shared interactive reading provides important opportunities to develop students' vocabulary. It also provides opportunities for students to develop their oral language skills. So again, this is a context where you use that high quality literature and pull together all these practices that we saw through the research guides. So just drawing back to the research, the 2014 practice guide from What Works Clearinghouse talks about integrating language instruction into content teaching. And so interactive reading talks about, in bullet 2, we see using instructional tools. So the tool we're talking about today is interactive reading that helps us to anchor instruction and help students make sense of content. So we're going to talk now a little bit about bullet 3, about providing opportunities for students to talk about the content and practice their oral language skills, and some ways to build that up. And so there's several ways that we can think about fostering students' oral language development. We know, for example, that children develop language through quantity and quality of the language input that they receive. So it's important that we provide emergent bilinguals with rich language input by modeling as well as responding to the language that they use. It's also important to allow children an opportunity to practice language, so to use their expressive skills. So we'll look at a few examples of what this can look like. Some listed out here, the use of questions, modeling, varying our vocabulary and syntax, and the ways to respond to children's language. So let's see what that can look like. One way that we can be responsive to children's language is thinking about the language that they use and using the tools of either recasting or expanding conversations with children. So we know that children are developing language and beginning to apply grammar rules, but it's natural for them to make mistakes or apply conventions inappropriately as they're learning. So there's no need to point out mistakes, but children will learn instead from the models of language that we provide for them. So one strategy for helping model appropriate language skills is what we call recast or recasting. And recasting involves taking children's language and repeating their statement using the correct grammar and sentence structure. So we see in this example, a child is talking about her stuffed toy, and she uses an incorrect grammatical structure of bear no like tea. So rather than correcting that, the caregiver responds by correctly framing the statement and adding on to it, saying your teddy bear does not like tea, and adding to that conversation. Another technique that we can use to be responsive to children's language is called expansion. So expanding means taking children's language and rephrasing their comments using more specific or extended language. So in the example here, again, the child and the teacher are going through some hand washing or dishwashing, and the child makes a comment about so many bubbles, uses a short phrase. So then the teacher can expand upon the child's comment by adding details, using more vocabulary, more complex sentence structures, again, modeling the high quality language input so as children hear that, they begin to develop their own language repertoire. So how can this be used in the example of shared interactive reading? Well, we see here the use again of the questions throughout the interactive reading. And you can see that in this example, there's opportunities and frames for the type of, for using questions, for recasting and expanding. So in the beginning, we have some open-ended questions that will encourage higher level thinking and children engaging in language about the text. So asking about, questions about, did the stranger pay for the food? Questions about what do you think this means? Asking them some open-ended questions about what's happening. In the section of anticipated response, this is where there's some structure there for the teacher to provide those recast or expand children's ideas. So you can imagine that for the question of, did the stranger pay for the food? The children might just respond out with a one-word answer, no. So the anticipated response there is to remind teachers that if the children, to provide them a rich language model. So they could respond with a sentence and said, okay, no, the stranger did not pay for the food. Again, just providing more opportunities to expand children's language by being responsive to their conversation. The other way that we can support children's language and oral language is through peer conversations. So here we see some examples and this can be used in higher elementary when students begin, reading and building out larger sentences. We see some frames for supporting peer conversation. And so this is how to scaffold by providing some sentence frames, some ideas for the types of language that we want them to be engaged with. And finally, within the COLDS program, we also had some opportunities for peer conversations, again, with the younger children, providing them opportunities for partner talk. So explaining something happening in the text. So in here, they're looking at a picture of the main character, Fernando, eating breakfast and what he's doing. And then providing a partner talk opportunity where children can use language and talk about their experiences. How is Fernando's breakfast different than your breakfast? So you see here the connection with children's lives, the connection with the text, and practicing this oral language skill of comparison. So lots of opportunity to both provide language models for children, respond to their language, and for them to practice their oral language skills. And finally, we can use embed language development activities by purposeful attention to particular and targeted instruction that highlights particular language features and then allows children to practice and apply that language knowledge. So in the COLTS program, here we had an example of teachers pointing out how adding full to a word means that it's filled with something. So they point out the word handful from the book, and then provide other examples like the word colorful, so that they can practice. How does this language feature, how do we see it show up in other words? This can also be used with a variety of different features of language that we can help pay attention to that happen within the text.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. So in the time left, we're going to touch just briefly on writing. This is not the main focus of the session, but we wanted to include this because there were opportunities developed in COLTS related to writing and writing to the text. And writing opportunities can be included even with early learners in the early childhood continuum. And so the next slide shows the specific practices from the 2014 practice guide that we showed earlier. I'll also say that there is another practice guide specifically related to writing, and in the resources list, we actually included all of the practice guides related to reading and literacy. So there are two specifically that discuss practices and recommendations related to learning and instruction for emergent bilinguals and English learners, but then there are others related to foundational reading skills and writing. And so from the 2014 guide, in the third recommendation, they talk about providing writing opportunities that are anchored in the content, in this case, aligned to the shared reading, aligned to the text, and provide opportunities for students to use their expressive language skills around academic language and writing. Children can work in small groups and pairs as well to help support their writing, and using explicit instruction and scaffolding in a variety of contexts can help support students as well. A lot of the standards talk about argumentation, informational, and narrative text with writing, and so providing opportunities around those text types as well help students. So we always get asked the question about how this applies to young learners in preschool and in early childhood. And so there are opportunities even in the, preschool years that children can have to write to their text. And so this shows an example of in COLTS, with each unit, there were writing opportunities at the end of the shared interactive reading. And so this shows an example of how you might use kind of interactive writing techniques where maybe students in a group contribute ideas to the text. And just similar to what Rebecca was describing with recasting and expanding, a teacher might use chart paper to explicitly show students how they can put ideas together and, expand and recast their ideas. So if you click through, we kind of illustrated this with some stock photos, but for instance, children were given a narrative prompt about what they liked about the book that they read. And so in this scenario, again, just an illustration scenario, a child might say that they like, when Lola pretended to be a farmer because they like farms. And then the teacher maybe can show the students how they can put these two ideas together using the word because. And so they're doing it in a group, but the teacher is calling explicit attention to some of the grammatical and language structures inherent in the writing process. And so you can kind of see, if you click again, I think you can see sort of the teacher doing that. And then there was an opportunity after kind of this group writing for students to do some individual writing. And again, in kind of early childhood, they might draw for their text, and then they maybe would dictate what their text might be. And so, for instance, they could draw a picture and then explain their sentence to a teacher, and the teacher would write it as the young learners are explaining their sentence, and that way they see the connected text and start to get some experiences and opportunities around foundational writing. So we just wanted to show how writing can be included even in early childhood education and kindergarten within that kind of early childhood continuum.
Okay, great. So just to wrap things up, we want to summarize some of the key takeaways from today's session. So one key point that we emphasized in the introduction was the coherence of the early childhood continuum. So thinking about the practices that begin through the pre-K and early childhood years that should be built upon and continued through early elementary. And then focusing on particular for the language and literacy development of young emergent bilinguals, thinking about shared interactive reading as a context for holistically combining reading, writing, listening, and speaking skills. And so today we focused on ways drawn from the practices of the practice guides that they can develop their vocabulary during that shared interactive reading time, how they can practice oral language, and how they can begin to do early writing. So again, providing the context and reinforcing that all of these practices are combined together to support children in the various aspects of their language development, and doing this through the context of shared interactive reading. And thank you for participating in our session today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren and Rebecca, for the great session. So just to remind everybody, if you have any questions or comments for our presenters, please share your thoughts and questions in the chat box. In the meantime, sorry, I don't know if you can hear the background noise. My 2-year-old is crying because he has fever. But speaking of which, I was actually just gonna point out that, this was a great lesson for me as well, as I'm trying to model a language development for him. And I was just thinking to myself that it is really hard to model a good language scaffolding, even though I learned about all this in my grad school, but it was really hard to put into practice. So thank you for introducing and just reminding all of us how important this is. I don't know if you have any thoughts or additional thoughts you want to share with our audience today.
I think one thing, as we were talking, we were putting in some of the resources in the chat. Sometimes we, because we work a lot with resources that are open access, for instance, through the National Technical Assistance and Dissemination Network. So hope we didn't put too many in, but I also think I'm getting a lot of questions about ways to support schools and local education agencies and state departments of education around professional development. And with a lot of it kind of moving online this year, with the pandemic, these are some resources that are open access that, kind of highlight some of those evidence-based practices that we talked about in this session, and other practices as well that can definitely be utilized in professional learning communities or with job embedded coaching or workshops. So we appended kind of to the session a list of these resources, these open access resources, and then we're trying to put them in the chat as the session was going on.
Thank you. And I think, if I am not mistaken, all these chats are still available if we come back after the session. So if you miss any of those, and I know we have documents available, but just wanted to mention that as well. I don't know if, Rebecca, if you have any other thoughts you want to share.
Yeah, I think in today's session, we really wanted to reinforce the continuum of how these practices can start in early childhood or the preschool years and then be built upon through the early elementary time. So that's what we're trying to show is, ways to begin these practices and then, develop them over time. So that's something that we're trying to demonstrate. and important to start bridging those conversations.
Right. Just a curiosity that I know we talked about kind of building this bridge before elementary school starts, but are you aware of any like good practice that this is actually happening, that local education agencies making these connections with the prior to kindergarten education with the kindergarten? Because I'm just hard to imagine that, there are a lot of private practices of kindergarten and childcare providers, and making this connection and having a continuum curriculum seems very ideal, but somewhat unrealistic, if that makes sense.
Yeah, there's some studies that kind of are looking at, they call it almost like vertical articulation in the professional learning community. So with professional learning opportunities for local education agency educators and schools, having continuity in the professional learning, and even opportunities where educators from early childhood might attend something with educators from early elementary, that helps in the continuum and helps to support practices practices around, for instance, the shared book reading can begin in those early childhood, years, and then also can still be used in early elementary. So at the very beginning, we added a couple of resources. One is the National Academies of Sciences report, and another is kind of a toolkit that educators can use to kind of understand what the coherence in their early childhood education continuum looks like.
Great, thank you. Rebecca, I don't know if you have any other words you want to add.
I think that's a good summary. Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you. I know we have a couple more minutes. If you have any final thoughts or questions, please share in the chat.
One of the things that we didn't get a chance to talk about, but was another component within COLTS, was just using the shared interactive reading opportunity as a way to also work on foundational literacy skills. And so within the early childhood education continuum, we were drawing on practices outlined from the National Early Literacy Panel as well as the National Reading Panel. And so supporting children in their phonics and phonemic awareness, and kind of the shared reading provides a good platform for that. So again, there's some resources that we posted that talk about it. We didn't highlight that in this session, but that's another, as well as working on language and writing and vocabulary, also looking at how the shared interactive reading might provide a good platform for the foundational skills can work too.
Great, good point. Thank you.
I know another frequently asked question that we get is, are these practices just for dual language learners to develop their language and literacy? And, the answer for that is, while these are certainly tailored for and designed and, come from the research base about how to develop language for dual language learners to support their early literacy and language development, there are certainly practices that are going to support all students in the classroom. So it's, providing that good language model, reinforcing vocabulary across multiple modalities are all things that we know are just really great for developing early language and developing their early literacy as well. So this is something that, would be useful in a classroom, whether you have, a few DLLs, you have several, it's going to be just good. They're going to be practices that will support all students' language and literacy development. So, clarifying that, these are definitely specific for supporting dual language learners and things that you want to do in addition to your normal good practices to ensure that you're helping them, but will really help all students along the way.
That's a great point, because good language modeling helps every student, regardless their background and their skills. Yeah. I was just thinking that I was just finishing up my study about the early reading development, and was really thinking about how the findings that my studies that shows the importance of a student's reading growth in first 2 years of their schooling from kindergarten to first grade, and how all these practices and resources that you've shared could really support really those young children to build strong foundation in their reading and language development. So
And focusing on, the skills that help students become proficient decoders in reading and kind of those more code-based components related to word recognition is really important in the early elementary school years. But also really important is those language pieces as well. And just to find kind of periods throughout the day where, teachers can enhance the language and conversations and vocabulary of students in their activities, and the peer-to-peer interaction is really helpful for students with that.
Good reminder, definitely.
Yeah.
Well, I think we have a couple more minutes. I know we have a little bit of break between this and the next breakout session. And Lauren and Rebecca, if any of our audience has any follow-up questions, I don't know if you can share your contact information so people can reach out to you.
Yeah, we'll go ahead and put our email in the chat. So if there's any follow-up questions, we're happy to elaborate on these practices or any of the work that we've done. Look forward to hearing what's going on in other areas and sharing more.
Right, and if you have any teachers and practitioners in the audience, if you try these resources and practices, and it'd be great to hear how it works with your classrooms and your students as well.
I should say too, though it wasn't the focus of the session, we did include some resources related to considerations for emergent bilinguals within multi-tiered systems of support, because that is a question we're getting a lot, especially now as many school systems are using MTSS or like tiered instructional frameworks. And there's some new resources that came out from for instance, the model demonstration projects that are funded by the Office of Special Education Programs. So we did include some of those, again, just as some additional resources. But if anybody has any questions on, how to use them, or if anyone's looking for ideas, definitely feel free to reach out.
Great. Thank you. Well, I know we still have a couple more minutes. I think the session ends at 2:15. Well, just want to say thank you again for our audience to join us today. But I have to say, this reading summit has been a great conference experience for me, especially that there are not too many concurrent sessions happening. It was really great to have our presenters today and share our resources that really can support English learners and your language learners. I don't know if Rebecca and Lauren, if you have any final words that you want to share before we close the session.
I think really promoting, especially at this point, collaboration structures within the school systems and within the building. So collaboration, among the teachers, as well as the, ESL specialists, the special education teachers, and also collaboration structures among educators within the early childhood education continuum. So, the preschool teachers, early childhood teachers, and the elementary school teachers will be really helpful. And I think some of those like tools that we posted at the beginning kind of talk about that, but really like enhancing the collaborative collaborations of educators is important.
And I would just add to that, circling back to Jasmine's original commentary and the increasing number of DLLs and ELs that we see in schools across the country. And, as Lauren said, that it's now not just responsibility of an EL specialist or a dual language or bilingual teacher, but that these are practices that we hope all teachers, as well as school leadership, are collaborating on and working to support all students.
Great.
Thank you for attending.
Thank you, everybody, for attending our session. And I guess we'll take a 15-minute break and then join another session. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.